Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet journey into the past. Today, we will wander through the slow, often overlooked moments of history, the ones that shaped lives, ideas, and the world we know, quietly and without fanfare. Here, time moves gently. We will linger in workshops, libraries, and sunlit streets, following ordinary people performing extraordinary acts of patience and care. So find a comfortable place, let your mind settle, and allow the stories of centuries past to unfold, slowly, like pages turning under candlelight. This is boring past times for sleep where history whispers, and you can drift into the calm rhythm of the past. You are standing in the Egyptian desert, and the air is heavy with the scent of hot dust. There is no sound but the faint hum of wind over sand. The horizon trembles like glass, and the sun, indifferent and absolute, watches from above. It is noon, or perhaps it is not. Here, without clocks or shadows that stay still long enough to be trusted, time is less a measurement and more a sensation. The ancient Egyptians, for all their monuments and mathematics, faced a strangely human problem: how to know when one moment ended and another began. For most of early human history, time was something you felt rather than something you counted. The rhythm of work and rest, the cycle of light and dark, these were enough. But Egypt was not like other lands. Its civilization rose from the Nile, a river so regular it seemed divine. The yearly flood could be predicted with uncanny accuracy, and from it grew the first calendars. Yet, even with calendars marking the seasons, no one truly knew how to divide a single day. In the desert heat, days could stretch endlessly. In the coolness of night, hours slipped away unseen. And so, in a civilization that built pyramids with perfect symmetry and mapped the heavens with careful eyes, there was an uneasy silence in the flow of daily life. The priests who tended the temples of Ra, the sun god, needed to know the exact hour to offer prayers. The laborers who hauled stones for the tombs needed to change shifts before exhaustion. Farmers along the Nile had to open irrigation channels at the proper times. Yet the only clock they had was the sun, and the sun is not always kind. When the day began, a priest could look to the east and see the red disk of Ra rising from the horizon, marking the start of the first hour. But clouds, or worse, the soft golden haze of desert storms, fun, obscured the sky. The sun, though constant, did not announce itself evenly. A day in midsummer was not the same as a day in winter. One stretched longer, the other shortened. The Egyptians, with their taste for order, could not tolerate such imprecision. Their solution was not immediate. Before water clocks, before sundials, before anything that truly kept time, there were watchers, human timekeepers. These were men trained to observe the slow movement of the sun and stars, to estimate how long a shadow took to shift across a wall, or how far the light reached into the temple courtyard. In the great temple complexes at Karnak and Luxor, these observers stood quietly, their task both sacred and strangely tedious. They were, in a sense, living clocks. Imagine one of them now, a priest standing barefoot on the sandstone floor, his linen robes pale against the dark columns. He waits, eyes fixed on a shaft of light that cuts through the hypostyle hall. The beam touches a carved hieroglyph at his feet. He whispers the name of an hour and signals another priest to begin the next ritual. That single motion, the shadow moving by a hand's width, was enough to guide entire ceremonies. But shadows fade, and light bends. The gods, it seemed, did not keep their own schedule. As Egyptian society grew more complex, time became not only a spiritual concern, but an administrative one. The building of pyramids, for instance, was an operation of staggering precision. Each team of workers had to labor in shifts to avoid exhaustion in the heat. The movement of blocks weighing tons had to be coordinated with exact timing ropes pulled together, levers raised at once. A difference of even a few breaths could mean disaster. The overseers of these projects began to realize that time could not remain a matter of guesswork. Meanwhile, the priests of the sun temples faced another difficulty. The night. The sun could tell them when to start the morning rituals, but it vanished after dusk, leaving them in darkness. Yet the Egyptians believed the gods did not sleep. Prayers had to continue through the night, especially for Ra, who traveled through the underworld in his solar boat, battling chaos before rising again at dawn. The priests needed to know when midnight fell so that hymns could be sung to guide the sun's journey. But how could one measure the hours when even the stars moved too slowly to mark them precisely? The answer began, as many things in Egypt did, with water. The Nile was not just a river, it was a clock of its own. It rose and fell, flooded and receded, with perfect rhythm. Egyptians measured their lives by it. Its coming marked the new year. Its retreat brought harvest. Water, unlike sunlight, could be controlled, contained, and observed. Someone, perhaps a priest, perhaps an engineer, must have wondered if the river could keep time across seasons. Could a smaller vessel of water measure the hours within a single day? But before that thought took shape, centuries passed. Egypt's early dynasties were occupied with grander matters: pyramids, mummification, and the politics of eternity. Timekeeping remained a secondary concern, something handled through habit and intuition. Still, evidence suggests that by the Middle Kingdom, the need for order had grown too pressing to ignore. The complexity of Egyptian religion, the coordination of temple activities, and the bureaucracy of the state all demanded finer divisions of time. It's easy to forget that this pursuit of time was not driven by curiosity alone. In many ways, it was an act of devotion. The Egyptians did not separate the sacred from the practical. Measuring hours was a form of worship, a way of aligning human life with cosmic order. To know when the sun rose and set was to participate in the rhythm of creation itself. To measure the invisible passing of night was to mimic the journey of Ra through darkness. And yet, even in their quest for divine order, there was something deeply human about their struggle. Time was elusive. It refused to be held, just as sand slipped through the fingers. The Egyptians tried to bind it in stone, to carve it into calendars, to map it upon the heavens. But still, each day began and ended without a sound, without a marker more precise than the light falling on a temple wall. Over the centuries, they would develop instruments, simple, ingenious devices that turned water into motion and shadows into numbers. These early timekeepers were not perfect. They required patience, calibration, and faith. But they represented something remarkable: the transformation of an idea, the invisible, passing of hours into a physical form. Imagine again that same temple courtyard. the air cools as the sun lowers behind the columns. A priest kneels beside a vessel of stone. He fills it with water from the Nile, clear and still. A narrow hole at its base allows the liquid to drip slowly, evenly, into another bowl below. The sound is almost imperceptible, just a soft, rhythmic tapping. Drop by drop, the vessel empties, and the passing of each drop marks a fraction of time. The priest watches, silent, as the last drop falls. He notes the level in the lower bowl and declares that the next ritual hour has begun. It is, in essence, the first alarm clock. But that moment, the invention of the Clepsydra, the water clock, was still to come. Before water could be trusted to measure time, it had to be understood. The Egyptians needed to learn how it flowed, how temperature and pressure changed its pace, how to make its motion steady and predictable. It was a slow process, centuries in the making, shaped by trial, error, and quiet observation. There is a kind of poetry in that patience. Time, after all, rewards those who move slowly. The desert, the Nile, the stars, all moved at their own pace, indifferent to human schedules. And so, the Egyptians learned to move with them, not against them. Their clocks would not tick or chime. They would breathe, drip, and flow. By the time the first clepsydras appeared in Egyptian temples, the concept of time had changed forever. What began as a problem of shadows in the sand had become a philosophia, recognition that even in silence, even in stillness, something was always moving. Water could fall, sand could shift, and the world could age quietly. And perhaps that is the essence of Egyptian time, the understanding that eternity is not endless speed, but endless patience. Theirs was a civilization built not on the rush of hours, but on the calm observation of their passage. You might wonder, then, how they managed to make this watery rhythm precise enough to serve a temple, or a city, or an empire. How did they control the flow? How did they turn a stream into a schedule? The answer lies in the invention that would define their mastery of hours on invention, both humble and revolutionary, carved not from gold or stone, but from the steady dripping of water. The Egyptians called it the Merkhet when they gazed at the stars, and the Clepsydra when they listened to water. Both instruments served one purpose: to turn the silent rhythm of the universe into something measurable, predictable, and human. The word Clepsydra comes later, borrowed from the Greeks, who admired Egyptian ingenuity, but its essence began along the banks of the Nile, centuries before Greek civilization even stirred. It began, as many Egyptian inventions did, not with philosophers, but with priests. In the dark interior of temples, where the air stayed cool and damp, priests performed nightly rituals to guide the journey of Ra through the underworld. The hours of night needed to be marked precisely too early, and prayers would interrupt the gods' passage. Too late, and chaos might gain ground in the eternal struggle between light and darkness. These priests had long observed the flow of water, for water was sacred to them. It symbolized creation, renewal, and life. Every drop that fell from the Nile was, in their eyes, a fragment of divine order. Someone, though we do not know his name, must have thought to capture that divine order in motion, to let water measure time by its own gentle rhythm. The earliest surviving water clock was found in the ruins of Karnak, one of Egypt's greatest temple complexes. It dates to around 1400 BCE, during the reign of Amenhotep, III. Though the design suggests that the idea was far older, the object is deceptively simple. A large stone vessel, shaped like a pot, with a narrow hole drilled near its base. The sides are inscribed with hieroglyphs markings that correspond to hours of the night in each month of the year. When filled with water, the vessel slowly drains through the hole, and as the water level lowers, it passes the engraved lines, each marking an hour. The priest could watch the descent of the water and know the exact moment to begin the next hymn, to light the next lamp, or to awaken the next watcher. It was, in essence, a water-based shadow-an imitation of the sun's passing, but one that worked even in darkness. The idea might seem obvious to us now, but for the Egyptians, it represented an extraordinary leap of thought. To build a clepsydra, they had to understand more than just the behavior of water. They had to understand constancy. They needed to believe that time could be divided equally, that 1 hour could be the same length as another. In a world where seasons changed the pace of life, where the Nile rose and fell unevenly, this was a radical concept, that the flow of water, if properly controlled, could mirror the steady flow of existence. The clepsydra's shape was crucial. Early designs were not simple cylinders or bowls, but wide at the top and narrow at the bottom, resembling a truncated cone. This shape compensated for the decreasing pressure as the vessel emptied. If the walls were straight, the flow would slow down as the water level dropped. But by narrowing the base, the Egyptians achieved something astonishingly close to a uniform rate of dripping. Each hour passed as evenly as the one before. Even as the vessel drained, it was an experiment in physics, centuries before physics had a name. Standing beside one, you might have heard only the soft patter of water into a collecting basin, a sound as calm as a heartbeat. In that rhythm, there was something hypnotic, perhaps even meditative. The temple would have been silent, except for that faint dripping, the glow of oil lamps flickering against columns carved with stories of gods and kings. Time itself felt slower there, measured, not in ticking seconds, but in falling drops. Yet the clepsydra was not just a spiritual instrument. Its practicality spread far beyond the temple walls. Administrators and astronomers began to use them as well. At observatories, the slow, steady flow of water allowed astronomers to time the rising of stars, to record how long certain constellations remained visible before dawn. This precision helped refine Egypt's calendar, aligning rituals with celestial events and improving the predictability of agricultural cycles. The Nile, for all its generosity, was unpredictable year to year. Knowing when the flood would arrive mattered not just for farming but for survival. The priests used the stars and their water clocks together, measuring the appearance of Sirius, the bright dog star that heralded the annual inundation. With each passing hour carefully marked by water, they could predict the river's behavior with astonishing accuracy. The clepsydra became an invisible partner in Egypt's governance. Time meant order, and order meant stability. In a society that prized balance, the principle of nothing could be more sacred than the mastery of time. Still, water was a tricky servant. It evaporated in heat, thickened in cold, and gathered dust if left exposed. Priests had to refill the vessels regularly, ensuring that the water remained pure. In the dry heat of the desert, a clepsydra's reliability required constant attention. Each drop had to fall from a vessel carved with precision and placed upon a level surface. The tools of time demanded maintenance, patience, and discipline, much like the concept of time itself. There were other challenges. The Egyptian day was not divided into 24 equal hours, as ours is. Their hours expanded and contracted, with the seasons longer during summer days, shorter during winter nights. This meant that the markings inside the clepsydra had to change. Each month had a different scale carved into the vessel. A clock from January would not measure hours correctly in June. Time, even in stone, remained fluid to adjust for these differences. Some clepsydras had interior lines arranged in uneven spacing, reflecting the changing length of hours throughout the year. Others required separate vessels for different months. The result was an astonishingly precise yet deeply human system, one that acknowledged the natural world's inconsistency while striving to bring harmony to it. And so, as the water fell, Egypt learned to synchronize not only its rituals but its very heartbeat to the rhythm of the clepsydra. Temples across the land kept time with dripping water, echoing the slow pulse of the Nile itself. It's tempting to imagine that the priests who maintained these devices thought of them as mere instruments, but it is just as likely they viewed them as sacred companions. To tend a clepsydra was to participate in the same creative order as the gods. Every hour marked was another proof that chaos had not yet triumphed. Time still flowed in balance. Outside the temples, in workshops and quarries, the idea began to spread in humbler forms. Some workers used simpler clay versions, rudimentary, unmarked, and crude, but functional. These allowed foremen to measure shifts or rest breaks. Others may have used inverted clepsydras, where water dripped in rather than out, raising the level inside a container until it reached a mark. These variations reveal a civilization deeply invested in measuring the imperceptible. But even as the clepsydra became a common instrument, its design remained surprisingly unchanged for centuries. Egypt's strength lay not in invention for its own sake, but in refinement, making something work so well it did not need to evolve. A water clock carved during the reign of Ramses II would look and function nearly the same as one used 200 years earlier. The Egyptians valued reliability more than novelty, and yet the world beyond the Nile was beginning to stir, too. The northeast, Mesopotamia, had its own ways of keeping time: shadow sticks, sundials, and counting sands. The Greeks, centuries later, would borrow both the concept and the name of the clepsydra, using it not in temples but in courts of law to limit speeches. Time, once sacred, would become procedural. The same steady drip that guided prayers in Thebes would one day cut short a philosopher's argument in Athens. Still, Egypt's version remained uniquely serene. Their clocks did not rush, they did not scold or warn. They measured time the way Egypt itself existed, patiently, rhythmically, forever tied to the movement of nature. When archaeologists uncovered the Karnak clepsydra, they found traces of blue pigment still clinging to the carved hour lines. It must once have gleamed faintly under the flicker of lamplight, water shimmering as it descended. One can imagine the priest's quiet satisfaction as he watched the flow, perhaps whispering a prayer of gratitude for another hour survived, another ritual performed. And yet the invention raised as many questions as it answered. If water could measure time, what else could? Could sand flow just as steadily? Could the stars themselves be counted not in constellations, but in minutes? The Clepsydra opened, a doorway into an entirely new understanding of the universe, that time was not merely divine, but measurable, not eternal, but divisible. That realization would change Egypt's relationship to the cosmos. It would bring order, yes, but also anxiety. For when one begins to measure time, one also begins to notice its passing. And in a land obsessed with eternity, that was a troubling thought. Because if water could slip away drop by drop, what else might fade just as quietly? You can almost hear it, the sound of water dripping in the dark, slow, constant, indifferent. That faint rhythm marked the heartbeat of a civilization. Inside the temples of Thebes and Karnak, water clocks were not merely instruments, they were companions of prayer, silent participants in Egypt's conversation with eternity. As the centuries unfolded, the Clepsydra became more than a means of keeping time. It became a symbol of divine balance, of matha, principle of cosmic order that governed all things. Each drop that fell through its narrow hole was a moment of harmony between heaven and earth, an affirmation that the universe still moved according to plan. And yet, like all things sacred in Egypt, the Clepsydra eventually found its way from the living to the dead. The hour of the gods in the grand temples, priests still tended the clocks with quiet devotion. Their duties were meticulous. Before each nightly ritual, the vessel had to be purified with Nile water mixed with natron salt. The priest would recite a small incantation, asking the god Thoth, divine scribe, keeper of wisdom, to bless the flow, to ensure each hour passed with perfect rhythm. Thoth was often depicted holding a writing palette and a stylus, sometimes accompanied by a lunar disk. He was the god of measurement and record, the one who wrote down the names of the dead and the minutes of the cosmos. To measure time, therefore, was to imitate Thoth himself, to borrow, if only briefly, his divine task of recording the order of existence. As dawn approached, the priests would extinguish the lamps and observe the final hour of darkness. When the last line of water touched the bottom mark of the vessel, a signal was given. The hymns of awakening began. The rising sun was greeted not with surprise, but with precision. Its appearance anticipated, measured, and prepared for. Time, for the Egyptians, had become predictable, and predictability, in their world, was sacred, time beyond the living. But not everyone watched the Clepsydra from temple halls. Some saw in it a deeper mystery, that if water could measure life, perhaps it could also measure eternity. As the new kingdom flourished, the concept of timekeeping seeped into the world of the dead. Tombs from this era, especially in the Valley of the Kings, reveal elaborate paintings of the Book of Hours, a guide to the afterlife journey divided, appropriately, into 12 parts, 12 hours of night. Each hour represented a stage of the sun god's passage through the underworld before his rebirth at dawn. For the Egyptians, death was not an end, but another kind of timing. The soul, like the sun, moved through darkness, guided by rhythm and ritual. The priest's water clocks on earth mirrored the journey of Ra through the unseen realm. When the vessel was emptied, when the last drop fell, the god emerged reborn in light. Thus, the act of measuring time became a rehearsal for resurrection. In some tomb scenes, Water is shown flowing in delicate streams between deities, sometimes emerging from jars held by the gods themselves. These are not idle decorations, they are echoes of the Clepsydra, symbols of divine order carried into the afterlife. To control time was to promise rebirth. To lose it was to fall into chaos. The clockmaker's legacy. By 1200 BCE, Egypt's mastery of water clocks had reached its height. The designs became more ornate, sometimes shaped like lotus flowers, or inscribed with scenes of priests tending to lamps and offerings. The marks along the interior walls grew finer, more precise, suggesting a deepening understanding of flow dynamics. There is something touching about this. The care with which anonymous artisans carved our lines into stone, knowing that each mark represented the passing of something they could never reclaim. Their work was not for fame or discovery, but for continuity. The priest would fill the vessel, the water would fall, and the ritual would repeat, just as it had the day before and the century before that. Some scholars believe that certain Clepsydrae were even designed for personal devotions, Mahler, portable versions used in private shrines or homes. If so, this would mean that the rhythm of dripping water once echoed not only in great temples, but also in the modest courtyards of Thebes and Memphis, marking the quiet passing of ordinary days. It's easy to imagine a family tending a small altar, listening to the water's faint music as they prayed for protection, prosperity, or peace. Time itself had become domestics, something intimate, no longer belonging solely to gods or kings. From the Nile to the world in time, Egypt's water clocks caught the attention of neighboring cultures. Traders and travelers carried the idea to Babylon, then to Greece. The Greeks, fascinated by Egypt's wisdom, renamed it Clepsydra, literally water thief. The term referred to how the device seemed to steal time away, drop by drop. But where Egypt's clocks were sacred, Greece's became utilitarian. In Athenian courts, the Clepsydra measured speeches. A prosecutor or defendant was allotted a fixed amount of water when it ran out. The speech had to end. What had once guided prayers now governed arguments. Still, the Egyptian essence remained. The notion that time could be measured continuously, mechanically, without the sun, shaped the very idea of civilization. The Egyptian Clepsydra stands as the ancestor of every ticking clock, every digital timer, every alarm that wakes us from sleep. And in a poetic sense, we still live by the same rhythm, each day poured into the next, each drop of experience marking a moment lost. The hour that never ends, but there is another, quieter legacy. The Egyptians, for all their obsession with order, never truly surrendered to the tyranny of time. Their hours breathed, their clocks dripped softly. Even their calendars aligned with the movements of stars and seasons, not rigid numbers. To them, time was not a straight line, but a circle. Each dawn was a return, each death a repetition. Their water clocks did not count down to an ending, they counted toward renewal. In that sense, the Clepsydra was less an alarm and more a lullaby, whispering that everything lost would someday flow back again. You might imagine one resting now, buried in the sands near Luxor. The stone vessel is cracked, its markings faint, its water long since vanished. Yet, in a way, it still keeps time. The desert winds have replaced the dripping water with shifting grains of sand, each movement another moment gone. The silence itself has become the clock. The Egyptians believed that when you truly understood time, you understood eternity. Perhaps that is why their civilization, though fallen, still feels timeless. Their monuments endure, their names echo, their hours continue to fall, unseen and unending. And if you listen closely to the wind, to the river, to the pulse of your own heartbeat, you might hear it still, that gentle rhythm begun thousands of years ago, when a priest first bent over a stone bowl and let the water fall. The first time you notice a shadow move, it feels almost alive. It stretches, leans, folds back upon itself, and then disappears, as if obeying some secret law you cannot see. Long before anyone built clocks or carved hour lines into stone, humanity's earliest timekeepers stood barefoot in the dust and simply watched the sunlight shift across the earth to the ancients. This movement was not just natural, it was divine. The sun did not merely light the world, it ruled it. Its journey from horizon to horizon, shaped when people worked, ate, prayed, and slept. And somewhere in that vast, blinding regularity, someone realized that the sun's shadow could be persuaded to tell stories of its own in the river valleys of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Perhaps as early as 3500 BCE, people noticed that objects cast predictable shadows. A tall stick in the ground would cast a long shadow in the morning, a short one at noon, and another long one in the evening, always in the opposite direction. The pattern repeated every day. It was so simple that it almost felt sacred, but there was a problem. The sun's rhythm was perfect, but the earth's was not. Clouds could distort the shadow. Mountains could block the morning light. Even the curvature of the earth caused small variations across regions. To read time from the sun required patience and consistency, qualities that Egypt, with its calm skies and boundless desert, possessed in abundance. The earliest Egyptian shadow clocks were astonishingly humble. Archaeologists have found fragments dating to around 1500 BCE, a narrow limestone bar, about half a meter long, inscribed with evenly spaced lines. At one end stood a raised crosspiece that cast a shadow across the bar. Each line represented an hour, though not the kind of hour you know today. Egyptian hours were elastic, stretching and shrinking with the seasons, because daylight itself did the same. At dawn, a priest would place the instrument on the ground, aligning it east to west. The rising sun would cast a shadow from the crosspiece along the bar, marking the first hour of morning. By noon, the priest would turn the device around so it could measure the afternoon. Simple, silent, reliable. This was the shadow clock, a wordless conversation between sunlight and stone. Unlike the water clock, which functioned in the hush of night, the shadow clock was a tool of day and labor. Farmers used it to pace their irrigation schedules, builders to organize their shifts, and temple attendants to time offerings. Even the overseers who commanded vast work crews along the Nile found comfort in its certainty. When the shadow reached a certain mark, it was time to rest. When it crept to another, the day's work resumed. In this way, the sun became both master and companion. It dictated the rhythm of every task, yet it did so gently by suggestion, not demand. There was something profoundly Egyptian about this arrangement. The sun, after all, was Ra himself, the living god of creation, the eye that saw all things. His movement across the sky was not merely astronomical, it was theological. When you stood beneath his light and watched your shadow crawl across the sand, you were, in their eyes, witnessing the god's journey. Each hour line carved into stone was a fragment of that divine path. To measure shadows was therefore to measure divinity. Still, the Egyptians were practical people. They may have believed in Ra's voyage through the heavens, but they also cared deeply about irrigation schedules and administrative accuracy. As Egyptian civilization grew, so too did its demand for order. The calendar was fixed, the Clepsydra refined, but the daily hours still depended on the sun's unpredictable pace. And so, the study of shadows became a science of its own. Priests and astronomers began to notice that the shadow's length at noon changed with the seasons. The noon shadow in summer was shorter than in winter, when the sun stood lower in the sky. From these observations, they inferred the tilt of the Earth's axis long before the concept existed in writing. They also began dividing the day into smaller units, 12 segments of daylight, 12 of night-reflecting asymmetry that would later echo in our own 24-hour day. It's curious how slowly such a simple concept evolved. Thousands of years passed between the first observation of shadows and the first standardized sundials. Time, it seems, took its time to be invented. The whisper of shadows if you had stood in ancient Thebes at midday. The shadow clock might have looked unimpressive, a bar of limestone, a stick, and the relentless Egyptian sun overhead. But to the priest tending it, that shadow was alive with meaning. Its slow, imperceptible crawl across the surface was a living texture record, written not in ink, but in darkness. The act of watching it was an exercise in patience. There was no ticking, no motion to mark progress, except the faint shifting of light over stone. One could only observe, wait, and trust the sun to keep its promise. There is something profoundly tranquil about that image of society that measured its days not in minutes, but in the slow folding and unfolding of shadows. Their world was never rushed. Each hour was long enough for work, prayer, and rest. This quiet precision shaped Egypt's psychology in ways we can still sense. Their architecture, the symmetry of pylons, the perfect proportions of columns, the alignment of temples with celestial points was born of their obsession with order in both space and time. The sundial was not just a tool, it was a teacher, reminding them daily of balance, patience, and rhythm in the desert, where almost nothing changes. The shadow became their most trusted companion of change. Beyond Egypt's Egyptian influence spread across the Mediterranean. The concept of shadow clocks traveled with it. The Babylonians, and later the Greeks, took the principle and refined it. The Greeks replaced the simple bar with a vertical rod, the gnomon. They measured the length and angle of its shadow to track hours with astonishing accuracy. The gnomon was more than a tool. It was a philosopher's instrument. Greek thinkers, such as Anaximander and later Aristotle, used it to study the movement of celestial bodies. They noticed that the sun's highest point each day changed with the seasons, helping to establish the geometry of the Earth's tilt and even the rough size of the planet itself. But all of that lay ahead. The true beginning of it all, this quiet empire of ours, was still here on the Nile. where the first humans knelt in sunlight and traced the edge of a moving shadow with their fingers. For them, the shadow was both a measurement and a mystery. It told them when to act, but never why. It revealed the order of heaven, but not its purpose. Each day's end brought the same lingering question: what happens to the sun when it disappears? That question would inspire myths, rituals, and the architecture of eternity. The sundial was not merely an instrument for the day. It was an invitation to imagine the night. And so the Egyptians built their world around that question. The sun set each evening, but it did not die. It traveled through the underworld to rise again. The same principle governed every clock they made, every temple they built: movement without loss, passing without end. The shadow disappeared each night, only to return each morning faithful, patient, and silent. But even as they mastered the art of tracking the sun's pace, another challenge arose. How could one divide daylight equally when the seasons lengthened and shortened the sun's path? Could the same dial mark both summer and winter with precision? The whispering shadows had given Egypt. Now they would need a way to command it. The Egyptians had always been masters of cycles: the flood of the Nile, the seasons of sowing and harvest, the waxing and waning of the moon. But the sun's daily rhythm, though steady, revealed a troubling imperfection. Each day's shadow moved at a different pace. The hours of summer were not the hours of winter. Time itself expanded and contracted, breathing with the seasons. To the Egyptians, this was both natural and unacceptable. Nature was divine, yes, but divinity, above all, required order, and so began their quiet struggle to make the moving shadow stand still. The measure of a god's patience at the heart of Thebes. In a courtyard washed in bright light, a priest of Ra might begin his day by aligning his shadow clock. He would drive a slender peg into the sand and adjust the limestone bar so that its marks pointed precisely along the east-west axis. The ritual was exacting. If he misjudged even slightly, the hour lines would shift, and the temple's daily prayers, which had to occur at specific solar moments, would fall out of alignment. The priest would kneel, whispering a short invocation to Ra. Then he would wait, and wait, and wait. The first thin shadows stretched across the marked stone like an ink stroke on parchment. He would note where it fell, perhaps even trace it with a reed pen. Then, throughout the day, he would return again and again to observe its gradual march. Each return was a kind of devotion, an act of attention to the divine precision of the cosmos. Over time, these observations accumulated. Centuries of priests recording, comparing, and adjusting the marks on their clocks began to reveal patterns. The solstices, the equinoxes, the longest and shortest shadows of the year, all found their place in the temple records. The Egyptians realized that the sun's apparent inconsistency could be tamed, but only through geometry. They began carving more sophisticated sundials, circular stone faces with 12 or more hour divisions, and a raised gnomon in the center. Instead of merely aligning it east to west, they now oriented it toward true north, compensating for the curvature of the sun's path. It was a subtle but monumental shift, the first stirrings of mathematical time. These improved devices were sometimes mounted on pedestals in temple courtyards, visible to priests and scribes, but hidden from the general public. Time was sacred knowledge. To know it precisely was to share in divine order. And such knowledge could not be wasted on the careless still. The world beyond the temples began to feel the change. The hour of the people by the late New Kingdom period. Sundials were no longer just priestly tools. Smaller, portable models began appearing in workshops and estates. One famous example, discovered in the Valley of the Kings, is little more than a hand-sized limestone fragment marked with faintly incised lines, perhaps carried by a foreman overseeing the construction of a tomb for the first time. Ordinary labor was divided not by instinct or the sun's position in the sky, but by measured hours. Work began at the first line, paused at the fourth, ended at the 12th. The discipline of shadow had reached the common man. Imagine it. The foreman sets his small dial on a flat rock. The workers glance over from time to time, watching the shadow creep. It becomes a rhythm of rest and effort, the invisible metronome of the Pharaoh's projects. Beneath the scorching sun, even the humblest laborer now shared in the order of heaven. But there was something else, a quiet unease that came with this precision. Before the sundial, time had been a feeling. The day unfolded like the river itself, fluid, continuous, without boundary. Now, for the first time, it was a series of boxes, each one distinct and measurable. To live by the shadows, pace was to live by division. Perhaps this was the beginning of human scheduling, of calendars and deadlines, of our lifelong partnership with impatience. Yet, for the Egyptians, this division was not tyranny, but harmony. It mirrored the order of the cosmos, the balance between night and day, between birth and death. The sundial, in their eyes, was a physical embodiment of math, the principle of universal balance, and so every moving shadow became a lesson in equilibrium, time's architecture. Innovation of the sundial reached its peak during the reign of Amenhotep III, a pharaoh obsessed with alignment, architectural, celestial, and spiritual. His builders oriented entire temple complexes according to the movement of the sun. In Karnak and Luxor, the axes of colossal structures mirrored the path of Ra across the heavens. The sundial was both inspiration and instrument. Priests and engineers used it to determine the precise moment when the rising sun would pierce the temple's inner sanctum on certain feast days. The moment was not guessed, it was measured. Amenhotep's architects became, in a sense, the world's first horologists, designers of time itself. Their temples were not just monuments. They were giant, living clocks. At dawn on the solstice, sunlight would creep through the great pylons and fall upon a statue deep inside, illuminating it for only a few minutes before fading. The people saw this as a miracle. The priests, quietly, saw it as geometry, and in that quiet fusion of belief and measurement, Egypt found its most enduring legacy. The union of sacredness and science, the moving shadow of empires with all empires. Egypt's control of time eventually became its weakness. Precision required maintenance, and faith required renewal. By the late period, priests still aligned their sundials daily, but few remembered the meaning behind the ritual. The device endured, even as understanding faded. The Clepsydra had replaced the shadow clock for temple rituals. Greek astronomers began devising more advanced versions of both, yet the old Egyptian models, with their gentle divisions and uneven hours, continued to appear in tombs carved as eternal markers of the day's passage to the dead. After all, time no longer moved. The shadow would not shift in the underworld. But the carving of a sundial on a sarcophagus was a promise that even in death, the soul would follow the same rhythm as the sun. Every sunrise was rebirth. Every shadow was return. The story of the sundial does not end in Egypt, though it was born under its brilliant skies. It continues wherever people sought to tame sunlight, to give its passage a name, a rhythm, and a rule. By the time the last Egyptian dynasties faded, their knowledge had already traveled north and east, folded into the curiosity of other civilizations. Time, once marked by dripping water and creeping shadows, had begun its long journey toward the clockwork of the modern world. But in those earliest instruments, sun, stick, and stone, lay the same ancient desire to see the invisible, to measure what moves us. The Greek borrowing when the Greeks encountered the Egyptian shadow clocks. They admired their simplicity, but saw immediately their limits. The Egyptian hours were uneven, longer in summer, shorter in winter, and tied closely to the latitude of the Nile. In Greece, the light behaved differently. So the Greeks did what they always did. They studied, debated, and reimagined. They adopted the Egyptian gnomon, the upright rod that cast a shadow, and placed it at the center of a horizontal dial marked with evenly divided lines. But they didn't stop there. They mapped the sun's daily arc mathematically, calculating where the shadow should fall at different times of year. Some of the earliest astronomers, including Anaximander of Miletus, used this principle to determine equinoxes and even the tilt of the Earth. For them, the sundial was not a religious object, but a philosophical one, proof that the heavens moved by law, not whim. And yet, even as they rationalized time, they kept a trace of the old reverence. To stand before a sundial was still to stand in awe of the universe's precision. The shadow, in its silence, whispered that everything had its appointed moment. The Roman inheritance centuries later, the Romans inherited this device, as they did so many things. The first sundial was brought to Rome in 263 BCE, seized as war booty from a captured Greek city. It was proudly set up in the Forum, where senators and merchants could gaze at its mysterious divisions. But there was one small problem. The dial was calibrated for the latitude of Sicily, not Rome. For nearly a century, Romans followed an incorrect schedule. The noon shadow in Sicily was not the noon shadow in the capital, and so, unknowingly, an entire empire ate lunch an hour late. It's strangely comforting, isn't it, to think that even an empire built on discipline could misread a shadow for generations. Eventually, Roman engineers corrected the error. They built more sundials, hundreds of them, each more ornate and precise than the last. Wealthy citizens installed them in courtyards. Soldiers carried portable versions on campaigns, and every city square boasted a public dial in time. Even the emperors used them as symbols of authority. Augustus famously erected a vast sundial in Rome, the Solarium Augusti, whose gnomon was an Egyptian obelisk, a relic of the very civilization that first tamed the sun. Its shadow fell upon a marble plaza etched with bronze hour lines, marking the emperor's control not just of the empire, but of time itself. And yet, despite all the grandeur, the principle never changed. A stick, a shadow, the patient march of light, the philosophy of stillness by the 1st century CE. Sundials dotted the Mediterranean world, but for all their usefulness, they remained curiously impractical on cloudy days or at night. The Clepsydra, and later, the mechanical clock, would eventually replace them. Still, there was something about the sundial that refused to vanish. Perhaps it was the poetry of it, the way it transformed stillness into motion, light into language. In some ways, it was less a clock than a meditation. To read a sundial was to pause, to look up, to notice the position of the sun. You could not rush it. It forced you into alignment with the day's natural pace. Even the inscriptions carved into them hinted at this awareness. One Roman sundial bore the words, Horum non numero, nisi, serenas, I count only the sunny hours. Another simply said, Umbra sumus, we are shadows. There is humility in those phrases. The sundial did not pretend to control time. It only revealed it. It was a teacher reminding its students that time was both gift and illusion, visible only when the light allowed the afterglow of Egypt tanned. So, in a way, the Egyptian priests who first knelt beside their limestone bars had set something in motion that could never stop. Every later civilization that gazed at a sundial, from the Greeks on their marble terraces to the Romans in their crowded forums, to the scholars of medieval monasteries, were, unknowingly, repeating that ancient gesture, bowing before the moving light. Even today, in quiet gardens and old courtyards, the sundial remains. It no longer rules our hours, but it still whispers of them. Its face is still turned toward the sky, waiting for a patch of sun. And when the light returns, it remembers its purpose, as if no centuries had passed at all. Perhaps that is the sundial's greatest lesson, that time cannot truly be divided. Every shadow cast upon the earth is part of the same long afternoon. The Egyptians sought to measure the day, but in doing so, they gave humanity something else, a sense of patience, a way to see the beauty in slow change. So, when you next notice the shadow of a tree shifting across the ground, think of those early priests and their quiet instruments of stone. Imagine the desert sun, the measured silence, the calm certainty that tomorrow the shadow will fall again, slightly different, yet perfectly the same. And perhaps you'll feel it too, that gentle, ancient whisper that says, time is not something we keep, it's something we watch. If you lived in Thebes 3,000 years ago, time would not come from a clock. It would come from a voice, from the slow echo of sandals on stone, the faint ring of bronze as a gate, the murmur of priests reciting the hymn to Ra, while the city was still wrapped in shadow. The first hour of the day was not sunrise itself, but preparation for it, a ritual awakening that began long before light touched the walls of the great temple at Karnak. The dawn within the temple each morning, before the horizon burned gold, a handful of priests began their work. They were called the hour priests, Wab and Renpet, literally pure ones of the hours. Their duty was to keep the temple synchronized with the motion of the sun god Ra. To them, time was not a human invention. It was divine rhythm, a cycle that needed caretakers. By the first faint hint of dawn, they would already be awake, bathing in the sacred lake beside the temple to purify themselves. Their ritual garments, linen, cool and immaculate, were set aside from ordinary use. No unwashed hand could touch the sacred implements of time. The schedule was precise, passed down through generations, and recorded in texts like the Book of the Temple, a set of instructions for maintaining divine order. Manat. The priests did not watch the sun directly. They followed its pattern through duties assigned to every hour. At the first light, they opened the sanctuary doors, awakening the statue of Ra with hymns and incense. They washed, anointed, and dressed the image, as one would care for a living king. When the shadow reached a certain mark along the courtyard, the next group of priests entered, carrying offerings, bread, beer, and oil, all precisely measured according to the hour. And when the sun reached its zenith, another priest would sound a conch or clap his hands 3 times, signaling the beginning of the midday rites. The city outside followed this rhythm unconsciously. Bakers began their work as the first hymns echoed. Farmers along the river looked toward the temple smoke to know that dawn had begun. The priests of Ra, in their steady service, were both servants of the god and keepers of every mortal's day. They were, in a very literal sense, the world's first alarm clocks. The 12 hours of the de-Egyptian days were divided into 12 parts of light and 12 of darkness, though the length of these hours changed with the seasons. To modern minds, such fluid time might seem chaotic. To the Egyptians, it was a perfect imitation of life itself. Each hour of daylight corresponded to a different aspect of Ra's journey across the sky. The first hour, his rising from the eastern horizon, triumphant over darkness. The third, his growing strength, filling the world with heat and vitality. The sixth, his zenith, ruling over all creation. The 12th, his descent, fading into the western horizon, where the gates of the underworld awaited. Each hour demanded attention, songs, and specific gestures. A missed recitation or delayed offering could disrupt the divine balance of the universe. The priests' bodies, therefore, became living instruments of time, trained to sense the passing of hours by the quality of light and shadow. The sounds of birds, the temperature of air, and the unchanging pace of their own tasks, no clock struck for them. They were the clock, the hidden calendar of flesh and stone inside the temple. Few walls were left unmarked by calendars. The ceilings were painted with stars, the walls with lists of feasts, lunar cycles, and agricultural markers. Yet, these decorations were not meant for the public eye. They were memory aids for the priests, a system of celestial mnemonics that allowed them to predict the seasons, solstices, and equinoxes without ever consulting an instrument. Every temple was both calendar and clock, its corridors aligned with the sun's course, its columns marking the year's passage through light and shadow. At Karnak, for instance, the main axis of the temple was designed so that, on the winter solstice, the rising sun would pierce directly through the sanctum's doorway, illuminating the statue of Amun-Ra. The priests did not guess this alignment, they lived it. Their daily service rehearsed the cosmic motion of Ra's journey, a divine schedule mirrored in their own, and in this perfect symmetry between heaven and stone, human and God, time itself became sacred. The living clock imagine, standing in that temple at dawn, the air still cool, the smell of incense rising, the first shafts of light creeping through the tall pylons. You hear the shuffle of feet, the murmured prayers, the rustle of linen robes. There is no sound of ticking, no ringing of bells, no mechanical rhythm, only the quiet certainty that each act is happening when it must. For the people of Thebes, this was time, not something abstract, but something performed. To miss the hour was not merely a scheduling error, it was a spiritual failure. The priests' vigilance sustained the world's order. Their voices marked the passing of light into darkness, the daily rebirth of Ra, and the ongoing survival of creation itself. It was not precision they worshipped, but balance and the human capacity to uphold it. Priests who erred in their duties could be punished, even dismissed from service. A late offering, an incorrect hymn, or a mistimed purification could be interpreted as an insult to the gods. To avoid such errors, priests trained for years under senior hour priests. They memorized entire sequences of chants, timed to match the movement of shadows within the temple courtyards. Some could sense the hour without looking, their bodies trained to respond to subtle changes in sunlight, filtering through narrow windows. In this way, human beings became instruments of astonishing reliability. Each priest's life was organized around an invisible metronome, the journey of Ra across the heavens. There were no weekends, no vacations, no true sleep beyond the god's rest. To live as a priest of the hour was to surrender one's personal rhythm to the rhythm of eternity. And yet, even these living clocks were mortal. When one priest fell ill, another replaced him. When one generation died, another took its place. The hours continued, uninterrupted. The temple, indifferent to its keepers, remained the only true constant. The sound of the morning hymn never ceased. Still, one cannot help but wonder, in that eternal repetition, did they ever grow weary? Did any priest, standing before the image of Ra at dawn, wonder what it might feel like to sleep through sunrise? The temples of Thebes never recorded such thoughts. But perhaps, somewhere behind the discipline, behind the scent of incense and the echo of chants, a quiet sigh once rose, a human whisper amid divine routine. By the time of the New Kingdom, around 1500 BCE, the great temples of Thebes had become more than houses of worship. They were engines of rhythm, vast, living machines powered by human precision. Every breath, every step, every flicker of light that passed through those halls contributed to the unbroken choreography of divine time. And at the center of that choreography stood the hour priests, whose task was not simply to measure time, but to maintain it. The weight of the hour. To be an hour priest was to serve a god who tolerated no lateness. Ra's journey across the sky was exact. His bark rose, sailed, and set at appointed times. The universe itself, from the stars' slow revolutions to the annual rise of the Nile, was seen as an extension of that pattern. To misread it, even slightly, risked disturbing the delicate harmony of Ma'at, the divine balance that kept the world from slipping into chaos. Thus, the priests were trained to embody both ritual discipline and cosmic awareness. They learned not only hymns, but astronomy. They observed the stars before dawn, marking which constellations accompanied Ra's rising. They tracked the sun's angle along temple walls, using both shadow and instinct to sense its movement. They were not permitted to guess. They had to know. Each morning, when the sun touched the temple's eastern gate, the first priest would raise a hand, not to block the light, but to salute it. The gesture was both greeting and measurement, a confirmation that heaven and earth remained in sync. The rhythm of service. The temple's daily schedule was divided into 12 daylight hours and 12 of night, each governed by a specific team of priests. The daytime orders cared for the god's physical presence, bathing, dressing, feeding, and praising the statue of Ra. The nighttime orders protected him as he journeyed through the underworld, performing chants to repel serpents and restore balance before dawn. Every act was performed at a precise interval. At the 3rd hour, incense was burned. At the 6th, offerings were refreshed. At the 9th, hymns of renewal were sung. Each sound that echoed through the stone corridors, the rhythm of chanting, the slap of sandals, the rustle of papyrus scrolls, was not random. It was metered, structured, practiced to perfection. And beneath that audible order lay an invisible one, the priests' hearts, beating in time with the day. They were not only servants of Ra, they were extensions of him. The human clock's design, the coordination required to maintain this schedule, was extraordinary. The temple staff numbered in the hundreds, from senior priests to scribes, guards, attendants, and laborers. Yet the synchronization rarely failed. How was such accuracy achieved in a world without mechanical clocks? The answer lay in hierarchy and repetition. Each senior hour priest trained a younger one, ensuring that memory passed unbroken from generation to generation. Their daily tasks became muscle memory. The number of steps between altars, the interval between chants, the slant of the shadow on a column at midday. The Egyptians understood that the body could be as reliable as a clock if disciplined enough. Even sleep was regulated. Priests rotated in shifts, some serving for a week at a time before retreating to rest. During their service, they lived within the temple walls, waking before dawn to perform purification rites, and sleeping only after the last evening hymn faded. Their bodies, bound by schedule, became instruments of astronomical precision. It was not faith alone that sustained the ritual. It was training, practice, and unending attentiveness. The timekeepers of the nightmost. Mysterious of all were the priests of the night. Hours, the watchers who served Ra during his perilous journey through the underworld when darkness fell and the city slept. These priests kept vigil by torchlight, chanting the book of the night in steady, rhythmic cadence. Each hour had its own verses, its own melodies, designed to mirror the god's passage through the 12 gates of the netherworld. They sang of serpents, of fire, of renewal. But their true task was not mythic, it was temporal. Their voices divided the darkness into hours. Their chants, measured and repeated, became a living chronometer, one that could outlast even the fading of stars behind temple walls. In some inscriptions, scholars have found detailed lists of these midnight duties, with notes such as, "At the 7th hour, Ra rests in his hidden form. Offer cool water and recite the hymn of silence. At the 10th hour, his enemies are destroyed. Strike the sistrum 3 times." It is easy to imagine them, those weary men in linen robes, swaying gently beside smoking lamps, their voices echoing in stone corridors, while the city outside dreamed. Their vigil was not glamorous. It was quiet, endless, necessary. They were the heartbeat of a god asleep. Time and power, but sacred precision, also meant political control. To command time was to command the people who lived by it. The great temples of Thebes owned land, employed thousands, and managed complex agricultural systems. The hour priests' schedules became the framework for civic order. When temple drums sounded at dawn, farmers began their day. When incense smoke rose at noon, workshops paused for rest. When the evening chant began, households lit lamps. The priests were not merely keepers of divine time. They were the unseen administrators of human time. In this way, the rhythm of Ra became the rhythm of empire. The burden of perfection. There was no room for improvisation in the service of hours. Each priest's failure threatened to unravel the illusion of divine constancy. Yet human error was inevitable. Papyrus records speak obliquely of punishments for disturbing the hour or confusing the time of offering. The guilty might be demoted, exiled to a lesser temple, or forced into endless night duty, a grim sentence of sleepless service. Imagine the anxiety of standing before the god's statue, knowing that one wrong chant, one missed signal, could mark the end of your sacred career, and yet, despite the weight of duty, most performed their roles with quiet devotion. They found comfort in repetition, in the knowledge that tomorrow's tasks would be exactly the same. It is possible they even found peace in it. Flesh and faith. There is something deeply human in their discipline. The priest's devotion was not mechanical obedience, but a kind of spiritual endurance, an acknowledgement that meaning can exist in monotony, to live by the hour. Day after day was to affirm that each moment had purpose, that even the smallest act, lighting incense, pouring water, reciting a line, could echo through eternity. Perhaps that is why they never built mechanical alarms or audible clocks. They already had them within themselves. Every heartbeat, every breath was a measure of time sacred to Ra. But as centuries passed, this perfect rhythm began to falter. The temples grew richer, the priests more political, the rituals more elaborate and less understood. The human clocks still kept time, but no longer for the same reasons. What happens when the keepers of time lose their sense of its meaning? For centuries, the hour priests of Thebes were the living pulse of time itself. Their chants, steps, and gestures echoed the journey of Ra, their lives intertwined with the sun's path. They were instruments of divine order, guardians of balance, and silent regulators of human society. But, like all living things, their perfection was fragile. The slow decline by the late period of Egypt, roughly 700 BCE onward, the temples of Thebes had grown enormous, wealthy beyond imagination, and increasingly bureaucratic. With expansion came complication. Rituals multiplied. Sacred texts grew longer. The daily schedule swelled with additional offerings, feasts, and ceremonies. More priests were needed simply to maintain order, yet fewer had the intense, lifelong training that their ancestors had undertaken. The human clocks were still in place, but their precision began to waver. Observers of the time note that some priests had to be assigned strictly to shadow watching or chant counting, because memory alone was no longer sufficient. The ancient rhythm of Ra, once so easily embodied, now required division into specialties: the singers, the incense bearers, the water pourers. The torch tender's time, once lived, was now fragmented. The instruments take over it. Was also during this period that mechanical devices began to share and eventually assume the burden of measurement. Water clocks, or clepsydras, became more widespread. These instruments, measuring hours by the slow drip of water, could operate regardless of sun, weather, or human attention. Temples began installing them alongside the living clocks to ensure that rituals were performed on schedule, even if priests were ill, absent, or distracted. Slowly, the authority of the human alarm waned. The rhythm of Ra could now be checked against a device, a silent, dependable, uncomplaining device. The priests did not vanish immediately, but the very act that had defined their lives, embodying the passage of time, became redundant. Their skill, honed over decades, began to feel ornamental. The last vigil, imagine a lone hour priest on a cool dawn in Thebes, just as the sun rises over the east bank of the Nile. He stands in the shadow of towering pylons, chanting the proper hymn, pouring water into the sacred basin. Around him, the temple buzzes with novices who watch the Clepsydra drip and mark the hours in silence. The priest feels the weight of centuries of tradition in his bones. Every movement, every word, every glance is a continuation of a chain that stretches back to the earliest observers of the sun. Yet he knows that soon these rhythms may be unnecessary. The device records the hour without human effort. The sacred patterns will continue, even if his voice falls silent. It is a quiet grief, subtle, almost invisible. Not the grief of failure, but the grief of obsolescence. A civilization's shifting priorities by the time of the Ptolemies, and certainly after Alexander's conquest of Egypt. Temples still operated, and rituals persisted, but the human element of timekeeping had largely faded. Water clocks and shadow clocks served as backup, and eventually became the primary tools. The priests of the hour remained, but their vigilance was no longer essential. The disappearance of the human clock was a reflection of a broader societal change. Civilization had learned to externalize labor, to rely on instruments, to trust devices more than flesh. The delicate dance between devotion and measurement, once inseparable, was now mediated by technology, in a sense. This transition mirrors our own world. We no longer rely on intuition or bodily rhythm to guide us through daily life. Our phones, watches, and computers regulate our time, just as water clocks replaced the living priests of Thebes, memory and legacy. Yet, even as their function faded, the human clocks left an enduring imprint. The precision, discipline, and awareness cultivated by the hour priests shaped Egyptian ritual architecture and administrative order. Temples were designed to channel sunlight, echo sound, and mark celestial events. The rhythms of daily life, agriculture, and governance were aligned with the ancient measures of time. Even modern Egypt's understanding of seasonal cycles traces since indirectly to those who once lived every hour as sacred. In their absence, we can still sense their presence. A sunrise over Karnak, a shadow sliding across a courtyard, the faint echo of chants in a distant chamber. These are whispers of a civilization that made humans into instruments of the divine and of time itself. Reflection, the human clock and modern life. The story of the hour priests invites reflection. What is lost when humans no longer embody what they once measured? What do we gain when technology extends our capacity to track, schedule, and control? Perhaps the lesson is subtle. Instruments can replace humans in function, but not in devotion. Time can be recorded, but only lived by consciousness. The priests of Thebes remind us that the most profound measures of life are not those on a dial, but those inscribed in rhythm, discipline, and attention. As you watch the shadow of a tree lengthen across your own courtyard, consider, once people's very lives were the alarms that marked the day, and in that, perhaps, lies a measure more precious than ours, a measure of patience, fidelity, and presence. In the dusty corridors of an Egyptian temple, the rhythm of the day was written not in ink, but in movement, shadow, water, and the steady steps of priests who embodied the passage of time. These innovations, the sundial, the Clepsydra, the careful observation of shadows, had quietly perfected the measurement of hours, long before the philosophers of Greece began to theorize about cosmos and order. And yet, like all subtle revolutions, their influence traveled invisibly at first. The first Greeks who encountered Egyptian timekeeping were travelers, merchants, and, eventually, students of philosophy. By the 7th century BCE, Greek emissaries were arriving in Thebes and Heliopolis, seeking knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and religious ritual. Among the treasures they absorbed geometric principles, star charts, and myths lay a less conspicuous but transformative gift, the measurement of time to the Egyptians. The day had been divided into hours of unequal length, a practical, flexible system designed to match the variable span of daylight throughout the year. The Greeks, by contrast, were obsessed with symmetry and abstraction. They admired the Egyptian devices, but sought to standardize the hours, to create a system that could be applied mathematically rather than ritually. This borrowing was the first tick in a long chain of adaptation. The early Greek sundials, travelers returned with fragments of sundials, limestone gnomon, and sketches of shadow clocks. Artisans and philosophers experimented with reproductions. They quickly realized that Egyptian instruments, while effective in the Nile Valley, were imperfect in Greece's higher latitude. Shadows fell differently. Days were shorter in winter and longer in summer, and the Nile's gentle flood patterns had no Greek equivalent. So the Greeks adapted. They raised vertical gnomons on flat horizontal dials, added markings for the 12 daylight hours, and began calculations to adjust for seasonal variation. By 500 BCE, sundials were installed in public squares of Athens and Miletus, offering citizens a tangible, precise sense of the day. The Greeks also introduced the philosophical dimension to time, whereas Egyptians had linked hours to divine order and ritual. Greek thinkers explored the mathematical relationships of light and shadow. Anaximander, for example, is said to have used a gnomon to study the sun's path, theorizing about the Earth's shape and rotation. The instrument became both tool and teacher. Thus, Egyptian practice was transformed into Greek theory. The hours were no longer merely a guide for ritual or labor, but a subject of abstract study. The Clepsydra crosses the Mediterranean alongside sundials. Water clocks, clepsydras, made their journey. The Egyptians had long used these devices to measure time when sunlight was absent or unreliable. Water flowed at a steady pace from one vessel to another, a simple yet remarkably precise system. Greeks encountered these clocks in temples and palaces. They were fascinated by the possibility of measuring hours at night during eclipses, or under the shadow of a cloudy sky. Inventors refined them, adding floating indicators, graduated scales, and mechanisms to regulate the flow more accurately. By the 5th century BCE, water clocks were employed in Greek courts to limit speeches, in theaters, to time performances, and in astronomical observations. The Egyptians had measured hours. The Greeks began to assign meaning, function, and, eventually, morality to them. A speech cut short by the flow of water was not merely brief, it was fair, equitable, and regulated by reason itself. The Roman reception, the Romans, ever practical, were slower to adopt Greek refinements, but eventually incorporated both sundials and clepsydras into their civic life. The first sundial in Rome, brought from Sicily in 263 BCE, created immediate fascination and confusion. Calibrated for a different latitude, it mismeasured the hours, forcing Romans to rely on observation and correction. Despite initial errors, sundials became common in city forums, military camps, and wealthy estates. Clepsydras, meanwhile, served in courts and administrative offices, keeping civic and legal time with remarkable consistency. The Egyptians had given the Mediterranean world the first frameworks of structured hours. The Greeks theorized about them. The Romans implemented them. Civilization ticked forward quietly, one borrowed hour at a time. The subtle revolution, the movement of Egyptian timekeeping across the Mediterranean, is a study in slow influence. No great battle, no dramatic invention, no sudden triumph, just knowledge passed hand to hand, from temple to port, from gnomon to clepsydra, until it reshaped entire societies. It is almost invisible to history, yet profoundly transformative. Time, once a flexible river shaped by priests and shadow, began to acquire universality, regularity, and civic importance. The question that would follow for centuries: how to adjust time for fairness, for consistency, for society, had been planted quietly by the Egyptians' patient measurements, and nurtured by their Greek and Roman heirs. And as these borrowed hours ticked across the Mediterranean, they carried with them a lesson rarely acknowledged, that even the simplest innovations, the silent counting of hours, can shape the rhythm of empires. The Egyptians had measured shadows, dripped water, and organized human labor in devotion to gods. The Greeks studied geometry, philosophy, and the cosmos. The Romans applied both to law, governance, and military order. Time was no longer purely divine. It had become human. Yet a lingering question remained, even with instruments and theory. Could humans truly control time, or merely align themselves with its inevitable passage? By the time Greek and Roman engineers began to refine Egyptian timekeeping, they faced a challenge that the priests of Thebes had known intimately, but approached differently. The day itself was not constant. Its length varied with the seasons, its measure shifted with latitude, and its natural rhythm refused to submit neatly to human expectations. To live by measured hours required more than instruments. It required adaptation, a negotiation between the celestial, the terrestrial, and the human. Unequal hours. Unequal days. The Egyptians had divided daylight and night into 12 hours each, yet those hours were seasonal. In summer, daylight hours were long and night short. In winter, the reverse. The priests' shadows and water clocks accounted for this naturally. adjusting ritual schedules to match the solar path. The Greeks, however, sought uniformity. Philosophers and mathematicians were uncomfortable with a system in which an hour could vary in length. Time, to them, should be absolute, a fixed quantity, like the distance between points on a line. Greek sundials and clepsydras began to reflect this desire. They incorporated corrections for latitude and seasonal variation, often using geometric tables to adjust the markings. Water clocks were calibrated to flow at different rates depending on the month, ensuring that a measured hour remained constant in legal, theatrical, and astronomical contexts. In essence, they were not merely borrowing Egyptian tools. They were transforming them, imposing human reasoning onto the natural rhythm that the Egyptians had lived with as sacred. The intervention philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle, debated the nature of time, using sundials and clepsydras as evidence. Plato described time as a moving image of eternity, a cosmic rhythm reflected in the celestial sphere. Aristotle, meanwhile, considered time as a measure of change, dependent on motion and perception. Greek thinkers thus turned the practical measures of the theachins into theoretical frameworks. The sundial was no longer only a tool to structure the day. It became a device to study the heavens, to calculate eclipses, to understand the passage of seasons. The Clepsydra was not only a nighttime aid, it became a means to quantify arguments, speeches, and the administration of justice. In other words, the Greeks asked a question the Egyptians had rarely posed: can time itself be controlled, or can it only be understood and accommodated? Roman standardization. The Romans, pragmatic as ever, turned these ideas into applied precision. They recognized that civic life depended on accurate timing. Markets, courts, and municipal events required coordination across large populations. Sundials were imported, adjusted for latitude, and installed in public spaces. Clepsydras became commonplace in courthouses to limit speeches, preventing anyone from monopolizing time unfairly. The Romans even marked the legal day into fixed hours for specific administrative acts, a precursor to the modern concept of work schedules and office hours. But unlike the Egyptians, who embraced seasonal variability, the Romans leaned toward uniformity. Their hours became standardized, paving the way for mechanical clocks centuries later. Precision engineers also refined the flow of water in clepsydras. Ancient Greek and Roman texts describe vessels with carefully measured inlets, floats that indicated elapsed hours, and even gears and regulators to maintain steady flow despite irregularities in water pressure. Such devices allowed the measurement of time at night or on cloudy days, freeing humanity from reliance on the sun. Egyptian priests had measured hours as a spiritual duty. Greek and Roman engineers measured them as a practical necessity. In this way, time began to serve not only gods, but cities, courts, and economies. Civilization ticked forward, increasingly independent of natural rhythms, increasingly reliant on human ingenuity. The social implications, the adjustment of hours, had subtle but profound social consequences. Once uniform hours were introduced, labor could be organized with unprecedented efficiency. Markets opened and closed at predictable intervals. Legal proceedings became timed events. Public rituals and festivals were scheduled according to a shared clock, creating social cohesion. But there was a trade-off. Where Egyptian priests had imbued time with sacred meaning, these human-made hours became abstract, detached from the natural world. Time no longer reflected the sun's journey but humanity's desire for order, control, and fairness. It was an invisible shift. The day remained the same length, yet its experience changed. People moved to the clock rather than the sun. Society became structured around devices rather than divine rhythm. Shadows and streams deaths, Egyptian methods, continued to influence practice. Scholars and engineers maintained records of seasonal shadow variations, ensuring that sundials could still mark noon accurately. Water clocks were often calibrated with reference to solar time, a nod to the centuries-old Egyptian wisdom. This combination of borrowed experience and new reasoning created a hybrid, a civilization where time was both measured and adjusted, both observed and engineered. In essence, the Mediterranean world had learned to borrow the hours, but also to shape them. Reflection, the adjustment of the day, was more than technical refinement. It represented a philosophical and cultural evolution. Humans were no longer simply followers of the sun. They became regulators, interpreters, and engineers of time itself. Yet, for all its precision, this system remained dependent on observation, judgment, and human labor. Instruments could measure, but only humans could interpret and apply their readings. And so, a question persisted, echoing across centuries. If time can be divided, measured, and standardized, can it ever truly be controlled? Or is it simply a mirror reflecting human ingenuity and desire? By the time Rome had fully integrated Greek and Egyptian timekeeping, the ancient innovations of the Nile Valley had quietly shaped the rhythm of Western civilization. Sundials stood in forums, clepsydras marked speeches, and the hours of the day, once uneven and fluid, began to acquire a standardized regularity that would persist for millennia. Yet the legacy of Egyptian precision extended far beyond mere instruments. It was embedded in ideas, social structures, and the human relationship with time itself. Egyptian foundations, the Egyptians' innovations, were deceptively simple. They had observed the sun's path, measured the drip of water, and trained human bodies to mark hours faithfully. Their motivations were spiritual and practical, to maintain Mat, the divine balance, and to coordinate ritual life with the natural order. This approach emphasized careful observation, patience, and repetition. Accuracy was not an abstract pursuit but a lived experience. Priests became instruments, shadows became guides, and water became the steady hand of time. These principles were carried across the Mediterranean. Greek thinkers studied the patterns, mathematized the shadows, and refined the instruments. Romans applied these insights practically, using sundials and clepsydras to administer law, commerce, and civic life. In essence, Egyptian timekeeping became a foundation upon which civilizations could structure daily life, governance, and intellectual inquiry. Time as a social tool, the introduction of measured hours transformed societies. Markets opened and closed according to a shared schedule. Public events, courts, and political assemblies depended on timing devices to ensure fairness. Engineers calibrated clepsydras to maintain consistency. Architects aligned sundials to the heavens. The Egyptians had taught their Mediterranean heirs that precision could serve not only the gods, but also society. In doing so, they shifted time from a sacred, ritualistic phenomenon to a shared, public, and ultimately secular measure. Even the notion of punctuality, a concept we take for granted today, has its roots in this lineage. To be late in a Roman court could mean losing a legal case. To misread the sun in Athens could disrupt a festival. The human impulse to organize life around precise hours was nurtured by the Egyptians, patient observation, and codified by Greek and Roman culture. Lessons in observation. Despite standardization, the natural rhythms of the world continued to assert themselves. Seasonal variations, the sun's irregular path, and the limitations of mechanical devices reminded humanity that time could be measured but never fully controlled. In this, the Egyptians' influence remained subtle but profound. They had demonstrated that careful observation, combined with disciplined practice, could achieve astonishing accuracy, but always with humility before the forces of nature. It was a lesson in patience and persistence, one that would echo for centuries. The perfection of measurement is less about domination than alignment. Enduring influences centuries past, mechanical clocks would emerge, automating the measurement of hours in ways Egyptian priests could never have imagined. Yet every sundial in Greece, every clepsydra in Rome, and every engineered clock in medieval Europe carried forward the legacy of the Nile. Even modern timekeeping, atomic clocks, digital displays, global time zones can trace its ancestry to the patient, precise efforts of observers and artisans in ancient Egypt. They proved that a civilization that watched the sun, trained human bodies, and measured the flow of water could influence the daily lives of cultures thousands of miles away. Long after the last priest had bowed before reflection, the story of Egyptian precision reminds us that history is often invisible. The innovations that seem small, quiet, and mundane, a shadow on stone, a drop of water. The rhythm of a human heartbeat can ripple outward across time and space, shaping empires and societies. Greek theorists, Roman administrators, medieval engineers, and even modern technologists all borrowed from the Egyptians, often unknowingly. The hours they measured, adjusted, and applied were borrowed wisdom, a gift from a civilization that understood both the mechanics and the poetry of time. And it poses a subtle question for us today. In an age of clocks, phones, and schedules, do we measure time, or do we allow it to measure us? Time is no longer divine, yet it continues to shape our lives. Perhaps, in that silent tick of civilization, the shadow of the Nile still moves across our days. In the bustling streets of Alexandria, a city built on commerce, knowledge, and the blending of cultures, time was once a tangible force. The Clepsydra, the water clock, ticked steadily in courtrooms, workshops, and observatories. Its gentle drip was a metronome for human life, marking speeches, rituals, and daily labor. But by the late Roman period, these instruments, once marvels of ingenuity, began to fade. The last water clocks were no longer maintained with the meticulous care that characterized their Egyptian or early Greek predecessors. Bronze inlets corroded, stone basins cracked, and the precision of dripping water became unreliable. Craftsmen who could repair and calibrate them dwindled in number, their knowledge confined to obscure treatises on papyrus, often undeciphered or ignored. And yet, for a time, the water clock was more than a tool. It was a symbol. In Alexandria, the Clepsydra represented the city's mastery of science and law, its dedication to fairness and order. Judges relied on it to measure speaking time in trials, ensuring that no advocate could dominate proceedings unfairly. Scholars used it to time astronomical observations, studying the heavens while water fell in perfect rhythm. The design of these clocks was deceptively simple. Water flowed from one container to another, sometimes driving a float or pointer that indicated the hour. But mastery required experience. Flow rates had to be adjusted for temperature, water quality, and evaporation. Every variable mattered. The last water clocks, they were embodiments of patience and precision, small miracles of human ingenuity, quietly recording the hours while the world outside Alexandria continued its chaotic rhythm. The human element, yet even as mechanical timekeeping became sophisticated, its function relied heavily on human observation. Each morning, a custodian filled the upper reservoir, ensuring the vessel was full and the flow unobstructed. At the end of each day, another would reset the pointer and record the hours past, marking them in scrolls that sometimes survived only long enough to be referenced by subsequent scholars. In this sense, water clocks were never fully autonomous. They were instruments in partnership with human care, a delicate collaboration between natural forces, crafted engineering, and attentive labor. When that human element declined, so too did the reliability of the timepiece. By the 4th and 5th centuries CE, the urban rhythm of Alexandria was changing. Political instability, economic shifts, and the slow decline of the Roman administration meant that fewer hands tended to these delicate devices. Temples that once maintained precise schedules were abandoned or repurposed. Courts no longer required measured speeches. Even scholars turned increasingly to textual studies rather than direct observation. And so the water clock began its silent retreat. The last observers. Imagine the scene: a single custodian in a dimly lit room, carefully watching the last clepsydra. Water drips into a basin, marking the passing hours. Yet the city beyond is indifferent. Merchants bustle, children play, and the waves of the harbor lap against the docks. The custodian, aware of the instrument's fragility, performs maintenance with reverence, knowing that if he fails, no one else may remember its function. These final observers were the last human guardians of an ancient rhythm. They understood the subtle interplay of flow, temperature, and calibration. Their knowledge was tacit, experiential, a skill learned through years of repetition, observation, and ritual. Yet they were not immortal, and their successors were few. As the custodian aged and passed, the water clock's measured drip would eventually fall silent. The end of the mechanical dathis fading of the clepsydra marked more than the loss of a tool. It symbolized the decline of a worldview. In the ancient world, time had been sacred, intertwined with ritual, observation, and civic order. Hours were not abstract, but lived. The disappearance of water clocks reflected the unraveling of that philosophy, a transition from embodied, observed time to fragmented and uneven human schedules. The last water clocks of Alexandria were monuments to a civilization's attention to detail and discipline, quietly measuring hours even as the society around them changed. But when the last custodian failed to maintain them, when bronze corroded beyond repair and stone basins cracked irreparably, the precise measurement of time slipped into memory. The world continued. Of course, life went on. Meals were eaten, festivals celebrated, and ships departed according to approximate reckoning. But the meticulous ticking that had once synchronized civilization, the patient rhythm of water and observation, had begun to vanish. By the late Roman and early Byzantine periods, the ancient systems of timekeeping, the water clocks, sundials, and human observances, were quietly fading from practice. It was not a sudden collapse, nor the result of dramatic disaster. Rather, it was a slow erosion, a quiet decay that left instruments neglected, knowledge untransmitted, and civilization's relationship with precise hours forever altered. The fragility of invention water clocks, once marvels of engineering, were delicate by nature. Bronze or stone inlets corroded, basins leaked, and wooden floats warped. Even minor lapses in maintenance rendered them inaccurate. They required daily attention, filling reservoirs, monitoring flow, adjusting for temperature, and occasionally scraping off mineral deposits. Sundials, meanwhile, lost their accuracy when left unaligned, obscured, or uncalibrated for latitude shifts. Human oversight had always been essential. The instruments alone could not measure time autonomously. As society shifted, these essential caretakers, custodians, temple priests, and engineers dwindled. Economic stress, political instability, and urban decline meant fewer hands to maintain the clocks. Knowledge that had once been carefully preserved and transmitted through apprenticeship and sacred texts began to vanish. And with that loss, a civilization slowly forgot the precise measurement of hours, returning to approximate natural rhythms of day and night. Cultural and social changes, the decay of formal timekeeping, coincided with broader social changes. Temples, which had been centers of both spiritual and temporal order, faced declining influence. Civic institutions, which had relied on sundials and clepsydras to regulate assemblies, markets, and courts, became less centralized and more chaotic. As urban life fragmented, people relied increasingly on observation of the sun, the stars, or seasonal markers to guide activity. Work, worship, and social obligations were governed more by human perception than by mechanical precision. In Alexandria and other cities, streets, once organized around measured hours, now operated on approximate schedules. Merchants opened stalls according to local custom rather than time decree. Scholars recorded observations irregularly, sometimes days apart. The rhythm of daily life became flexible, natural, and increasingly inconsistent. The most poignant aspect of this decay was the loss of technical knowledge. Manuals describing the construction and calibration of clepsydras were no longer copied, and the expertise required to produce accurate devices became rare. Craftsmen trained in the art of water flow measurement disappeared as workshops closed. Occasionally, texts survived in fragments, a reference to a floating indicator here, an illustration of a reservoir there, but without context. These remnants could not preserve functionality. Centuries later, scholars in the Islamic Golden Age would rediscover and reinterpret such texts. But in the interim, the art of precise water clock maintenance lay dormant, forgotten by the societies that had once relied upon it daily. The human element, lost equally significant, was the disappearance of the human observant. In Egypt and early Greece, time had been embodied in priests and custodians. These living clocks, trained over decades, were capable of intuitive adjustments that no mechanical instrument could replicate. When these individuals were no longer present, when civic and religious structures no longer required constant vigilance, the subtle knowledge of aligning instruments with shadows, seasonal shifts, and celestial patterns vanished. Time became abstract, measured only in generalities, rather than observed, lived, and interpreted. The pulse of civilization slowed, moving with approximation rather than precision. A silent transition, this quiet decay of timekeeping, had long-term consequences. Societies that once operated under carefully measured rhythms had to adapt. Festivals, markets, and civic events became irregular. Legal procedures lacked the enforced timing of clepsydras. Even navigation and astronomy suffered when precise measurement of hours and intervals was no longer routine. And yet, life continued. Human intuition compensated for the absence of instruments. The Nile still flooded, stars still marked seasons, and natural cues guided labor and ritual. Civilization persisted even as the meticulous tracking of hours, perfected over millennia, slipped from daily practice. The story of the last water clocks is a meditation on impermanence. Inventions, no matter how ingenious, require care, transmission, and human commitment. Without these, even the most transformative technologies can fade into oblivion. Reflection: the decay of ancient timekeeping illustrates a subtle truth about human history. Progress is fragile, dependent not just on invention, but on the dedication of countless invisible hands and minds. As water clocks stopped dripping, sundials lost alignment, and priests passed away, a civilization's intimate relationship with time quietly unraveled. Yet, perhaps paradoxically, this decay also allowed time to become more human, more approximate, and more adaptable, a reminder that even in loss, life finds a way to persist. The question that lingers, echoing across the centuries, is haunting. When the tools of civilization fail, what else vanishes along with them, and what can endure in memory alone? And so, our journey through the quiet corners of history comes to a pause. The workshops, the libraries, the hands that labored patiently, they remain in memory. Even as centuries pass and the world continues to change, remember, the significance of history often lies not in grand events, but in the small, persistent acts of care, curiosity, and human resilience. As you rest, carry these quiet stories with you, allowing the calm rhythms of the past to linger. And when you wake, perhaps you will glimpse, even briefly, the enduring power of ordinary moments that shaped our world. Thank you for joining us in Boring Past Times for Sleep. Until the next quiet journey, may your thoughts drift gently like candlelight across ancient parchment.